Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we are now going to be diving into the matchup between the Ravens and the Commanders. We just talked about the Bengals-Giants and what was the Sunday Night Football game. This was the game that a lot of people wanted flexed into that spot, and ultimately, I think it would have had a little bit more juice. Ultimately, it was a pretty good game where the Ravens were able to sort of control the majority of the game, I would say, but the Commanders still a lot to feel good about coming out of this game, specifically Jaden Daniels still holding his own, and this team as a whole just being able to be in the mix with one of the top dogs in the NFL in the Ravens. But we can start on the Ravens side of this because this is their fourth straight win, and after what was maybe a little bit of a concerning start to the year, they are sort of back to who they should be, and we've been talking for weeks now about the idea of this identity. Nothing's changed in terms of how dominant that run game is. Derrick Henry in this game, 132 yards and 2 touchdowns. He continues to be a monster. Lamar Jackson adding to some of that as well. He did the majority of his damage through the air, 323 passing yards. So I think it's been important for the Ravens to be able to, even if it is against two, not excellent secondaries in the Bengals and the Commanders, but I think it's been good for Lamar to still show people that he can throw the ball as well. I think that he is one of the most disrespected greats that we've had in recent NFL history, and it is encouraging to see that he, of course, still has that. He has the interception. I think blame goes maybe a little bit 50-50. That one was in the red zone where he threw it a little bit ahead of Mark Andrews, but it hit him in the hands. It definitely could have been caught. That one pops up. But, it was that play, and it was the fumbled snap just outside of the red zone in the first quarter. Those two together sort of kept the Commanders in this game. It could have been a much bigger blowout win for the Ravens. Ultimately, I'm glad that it was a little bit more competitive because it's more fun for us as viewers. But, I come out of this game feeling excellent about the Baltimore Ravens and where they are currently at. They're, again, firing on all cylinders. You see Zay Flowers being able to have what was, I feel like statistically, probably his biggest game, if I had to guess off the top of my head, where he finished with 132 receiving yards. He was, had 9 catches as well on every single one of his targets, just stepping up in the moments where he needed to. Yeah, this was his game with the most receptions and receiving yards, so that's a huge plus there. Obviously, touchdown share has not been there for him up to this point in the season, only 1, but that's also kind of what you get when you play in this Baltimore Ravens offense with Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson both in the backfield together. When you get down by the goal line, you know where the ball is going. It's one of those two guys. So I think that Zay Flowers was really encouraging from what we saw from that game. I mentioned Mark Andrews had a drop, but at least a little bit more involved in the offense, 66 yards and a touchdown. So that was good for him as well. But overall, the Ravens, this is kind of what I expected from them in this game. And again, could have been a much bigger win. So hard to pick out too many flaws in this team other than the fact that they are still kind of struggling against the pass, which would be my biggest concern for them. And they've played some good opposing quarterbacks up to this point in the year, but Jaden Daniels in this game, 269 passing yards. That is just the second lowest yards allowed to an opposing quarterback through these first 6 games. Only Josh Allen had less, interestingly enough, in week 4. But, I just think that ultimately it's not like 269 yards is like mind-shatteringly big, but they've had too many opportunities, I think, this game, and have just this season against some subpar passing offenses. Ultimately, I'm really looking at that Raiders game where Gardner Minshew carved them up in the second half of that. But secondary is good. I think that we're seeing Nate Wiggins take on some, have some bigger moments for him in this game in the past couple weeks. But, still something to take into consideration is the fact that the secondary still not performing at their highest level. But on the Commanders' side of this game, and ultimately, I think that it was more interesting what they were going to do against the Ravens. I always thought this was the Ravens' game to win. It was more so about, can the Commanders hang? And ultimately, they got some breaks, like I mentioned, in the first quarter with a couple Ravens turnovers inside of the Washington 25, but still, Commanders did a pretty good job of hanging in this game as a whole. Now, the issue is their defense, and that is sort of where, if you aren't a believer in the Commanders, it's that you think that they can still be gashed a little bit more, and seemed that way in this game, allowing a total of 484 yards to the Ravens offense, a very good Ravens offense, a physical one for sure, that isn't a great matchup, but that being said, I mean, the optimism for the Commanders' defense comes from that front seven with some of the, big guys, big names that they either drafted within the past handful of years or spent some money on a couple of these guys this past offseason, and ultimately they got gashed, is just the reality of the situation there. And that part of it is a little bit discouraging. I would add to that, at least a positive out of that front seven, which again, I do think overall can be good for them, is that this was the second game in the past few weeks that we saw Washington go up against an opposing quarterback that is very mobile. When you look at Lamar Jackson this week, and it was Kyler Murray a couple weeks ago, and in both of those games, they did a very good job of limiting the extra rushing attempts from both Lamar and Kyler. In this game against Lamar, he broke out that 33-yard run on a zone read in the third quarter, but other than that, he had just 10 carries, or just 7 yards on 10 carries, so very good job bottling him up there. And then when we reacted to the Commanders-Cardinals game a couple weeks ago, we mentioned the fact that Kyler had just one scramble attempt, which is probably one of the only times Kyler has ever finished with one rush attempt while he's actually fully healthy. So Dan Quinn, the strategist, obviously coming from a defensive background as a defensive coordinator, he invested into some of these edge rushers, and they're doing a very good job at containing. And maybe it's a little bit, to some degree, a moral victory there after you still allow 480 yards, but I think it's still noteworthy that, that is a front seven that can provide something for you. And ultimately, they end up losing this game. The secondary, I do still think, is a pretty significant concern. Benjamin St-Juste was getting torched for a lot of this game, both from penalties and just allowing receptions. Manuel Forbes, who I believe was inactive for this game, not sure if he's ever... it was a first-round pick from last season. I've never been a believer in him. We'll see what he is able to provide once he gets back out on the football field for them. Mike Sanderstill, big fan of him. I actually played against him in high school football, and so I've been following his career since then. When he went to Michigan, switched from a wide receiver to a defensive back. He records his first career interception in this game, somebody that I do think also has a pretty bright future. Because of the fact that Forbes hasn't been available for them, he's been playing a little bit more on the perimeter. I think Sanders still can be his best more so in the slot as a nickelback, but either way, it's not that they are totally without talent in that secondary, but in terms of being legitimate Super Bowl contenders this season, I just don't think that defense top to bottom is good enough at this current moment, and it's not something that can't be built upon for the future. I think that the Commanders, for a lot of people, were dark horse playoff contenders. If they weren't that for people, they were out of the playoffs, including myself. I did not see this level of success from the Commanders coming into the season. I thought it was going to be too much for that offense to overcome in terms of a defense that isn't great. But, they've looked, I would say, pretty clearly to be the best team in the NFC East up to this point in the year. Now, they're leading the division right now at 4-2. Certainly a long way to go, especially considering the fact that the Commanders, even when they've been competitive in these past handful of years, losing the divisional games has been the Achilles heel for them. You look at last year when they were neck and neck with the Eagles in each of those games, weren't able to actually pull it off. You can see if maybe on the fly here we can look at what their divisional record would have been. But They lost. They lost both of their games to the Eagles. Looks like as well they lost both of their games convincingly to the Cowboys as well. So this is a situation for them, and they lost both their games to the Giants. So not winning a single divisional game last year, that is obviously going to be extremely hard to overcome. Now it feels like the Commanders have a chance this upcoming season to be able to rectify some of that. Looks like the first divisional game is in a few weeks from now in week 9 on the road against the Giants. That is really where, as much as yes, the fact that they were in this game against the Ravens, you can feel good about them. I don't think it totally sways where I'm at with them because, again, this game could have gone very differently in terms of if you look at the success that the Ravens offense was having versus what the Commanders were able to do. Ultimately, the score could have looked a lot differently if it weren't for some self-inflicted wounds in the first quarter for the Ravens. But these are two good teams, and probably two teams. Ravens obviously are. Commanders, I would still probably argue, are a top 10 team in the NFL. You'll have to stick with us for, I think, Thursday is probably usually when we do our top 10 teams in the NFL. So see whether or not the Commanders are able to hold on to one of those spots. They were 8 coming into this week, or 8 or 9. So we will see about that. But we are going to be now moving on here from one rookie quarterback in Jaden Daniels to another one that made his NFL debut, and that is Drake May, who got his first career NFL start yesterday. I actually was at the game, so I got to, be at least in the building for it. So we'll be diving into what I saw from him and just the overall situation of what does the remainder of the season look like for New England and for Drake May. So we are going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we are going to take our final break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.